I destroyed my old jet ski and turned it into an insanely fast and dangerous mini boat. I then tricked it out into the ultimate fishing machine.
The boating market is absolutely crazy, and you practically have to be a millionaire to own a boat just to get out on the water and go fishing. So I've been searching all over Facebook Marketplace for tiny boats and small fishing skiffs, but what I keep seeing over and over are piece of junk jet skis. Facebook Marketplace is absolutely flooded with these things. Some of them are free and most of them are only a couple $100s. So I thought, that could be an awesome way to create a nice, cheap fishing boat. So I bought this one right here. Now this one checks a couple of boxes. First off, it's a two-seater. So that means the hull is a little bit longer than most other skis. I think that's gonna be the perfect size to build a micro skiff out of. Secondly, this one came on a trailer, which is awesome. Now I got the trailer, I can wheel it down to the boat ramp. Let me show you the engine here. Let me lift up the seat. That's the engine in right there. Blown engine, it's all in pieces. Got the fuel tank up there. I do need to be careful about that. Before I start cutting into this jet ski a lot, I need to remove that fuel tank because it does have gasoline and that is a big fire and explosion hazard. Handlebars are just ripped off. The gauge set absolutely destroyed. The hood up in here is just filled with junk components. It looks like we've got the old nozzle in there. I'm not sure what this is, handlebar covers. Absolute piece of junk. So we got to start clearing off the old components of the jet ski the down and dirty way. Now I could yank the engine out of this hole here, but it looks like this whole front piece here unbolts off the ski. I see a couple of big bolts. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and just cut all of these cables in here. All right, look at that. Okay, just the steering cable holding it on still.
The steering cable was incredibly rusty and had a lot of spurs sticking out of it.
Get this fuel tank out. I'm just gonna go ahead and cut all these fuel lines, and then this thing should just be ready to come right out of here. So this is all disconnected. Tubes, okay, them out of here.
The fuel tank was just held in with a couple nylon straps.
Okay, that must be the oil tank there. And that's the fuel tank. Now I need to get the engine mounts loose. All right, this engine should just lift forward now. Oh, and it's heavy. I can't get that engine to budge out of place. So I'm gonna use the winch and attach it to the engine and try and yank the engine forward. Something is still holding this back. Okay, I see what it is. It's the exhaust down there that's holding it in place. Let's see if we can cut it.
Now with all the lines and wires cut, the engine was free. I hoisted the engine out, probably weighed over 100 pounds, and a scrap metal guy came by and took it away for free.
Engine is out. All right, I want to show you what we got in here now that the engine's out. Here's the old flex coupling that goes in between the jet pump and the engine itself. And this had actually sheared off of the shaft that goes down to the jet pump. So this thing had some serious problems with it. Now I need to get the rest of this cleared out. Now that the engine and fuel tank are all removed from the jet ski, it's time to cut this. Now I had two ideas on this. I could cut it below the rub rail here and use this part of the hull. However, I do like the rub rail on the boat. It makes a really nice protective edge if you're bumping into dock or things like that. So I think I'm gonna try and cut it above the rub rail and attach my deck on top of it. I also need to flip the ski over, take the jet pump out, and somehow fiberglass over that hole as well.
So I used the Sawzall and started cutting the top part of the ski. I tried to make sure to stay at least 1 to 2 inches inside from the rub rail. That way I will have a nice lip to attach the new deck onto all around the ski. I had to go through a couple blades because fiberglass is very hard and it does tend to wear out the blades, which are made for wood. Some parts of the ski were very difficult to cut through because of the odd contours and angles. Also inside of the ski, there are bulkheads, stringers, and stiffeners that are glued in different places inside the hull. So I'd be cutting along and all of a sudden I would hit a nice thick spot and I would have to push through and cut through about 1 inch of fiberglass material. I pulled out the emergency flotation foam and saved it so I could use it again later. Now that I have access to the inside of the ski, I had to cut out the main engine compartment bulkhead, which was very difficult. I tried to clean up the fiberglass dust along the way because this stuff is really nasty. I cut the last piece of the ski that was sticking up, and then it was time to flip the ski over and start removing the jet pump on the bottom. So I used the impact gun and popped out all the bolts on the intake housing. The intake screen came off pretty easily, and then I went and disconnected the bolts that hold the impeller housing on, and I flipped it back over and tried to bang out the impeller shaft. The shaft was having a hard time coming out, so I used some pry bars and I popped off the bearing carrier, but the seal housing was stuck in place and did not want to come off of the bulkhead. I banged the shaft in a little more and then used the grinder to cut through the shaft. I was then able to bang the shaft all the way out, and this allowed me to reach in and pull out the impeller shaft from the back of the boat. I flipped the ski back up on its side and tried to pull out the jet pump housing, and it was still stuck. So I put it back on the ground and I used a Sawzall and a long blade and just cut off the seal housing completely. Then I was able to pull the entire jet pump housing out. And last, I disconnected the exhaust outlet fitting.
So it's all looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the shape of the hull. And now we need to get this over into the grass and get it all pressure washed out.
I washed out the fiberglass dust and years of grease and grime, and the hull turned out really nice. But now it's time to glass over all the holes and make it seaworthy again. I used a hole saw and cut out some fiberglass plugs from old pieces of the ski. That way I could make plugs to go into the holes so that it would be easier for me to glass over. I got some high quality 2-part epoxy resin. I mixed it up with the correct ratio and I added this fumed silica thickener. This turns it into more like a peanut butter, and it makes it real easy to work with when you're using the epoxy for filler. I pasted the epoxy inside the old jet pump hole, and I pasted epoxy all over the fiberglass plug and very carefully pressed it in place. I then used the stick to fare out the epoxy all around the perimeter. I got this other type of epoxy for fiberglass laminating. I mixed it up and I added some white pigment into it. That way it would blend in a little bit better on the hull repairs. This part of the ski had actually been smashed through completely, so I applied epoxy resin, pushed in the fiberglass mat, and I applied a lot more epoxy resin until the mat was completely soaked up. Using woven glass mat laminated with epoxy resin is incredibly strong, so I also applied it on top of the jet pump hole repair and onto the exhaust port hole repair as well. I still had a lot more of this white pigmented epoxy resin mixed up, so before it cured, I applied it all over the inside of the hull of the ski, and it made this thing look absolutely beautiful. Everything is nice and smooth and glossy and white now. Later that day, Old School stopped by and we had a little bit of a disagreement on how we should design the back of this boat. So you think air is going to get in that pocket right there?
Yes. Absolutely.
I would think you could go higher with the motor and this would channel water to it.
Gonna pick up air here and the thing will cavitate out. You go over a way, the thing will go and come off plane.
I'll dam this off here and fill this with foam because I want more buoyancy in the back. So I can just cut that, and I got fiberglass and I'll put it on and glass it in. So I measured out the old jet pump cavity and traced it out onto a piece of wood. I used a bleach bottle to try and match up the radius that I needed. And then I went and cut out the piece of wood and used a grinder and smoothed it out so that it would fit in the pump cavity hole. On one of the scrap parts of the ski I cut off, I found a nice big flat spot on the footwell. So I went and I cut out a big board, that way I could cover off the top of the pump cavity hole. I mixed up some more epoxy resin and thickened it up with some filler. I applied the epoxy resin paste all over the cutout that I made and put it into the pump cavity hole. Smoothed it out really nice with the stick. I then applied it all over the perimeter of the top of the pump cavity hole and applied the piece of board that I cut from the old ski. So now I've got a big nice piece of fiberglass and I only have to seam off the edges. I used the heat gun to help cure the epoxy faster so I could get on to the next step. I applied a few more layers of epoxy resin nice and thin. I then sanded it out nice and smooth all over in preparation for doing glass mat repairs. While epoxying this board into place is very strong, I wouldn't trust it out on the water, so I poured in more epoxy and laid out some fiberglass mat. I poured on some more epoxy, spread it out, and then I really rolled it in good with a fiberglass mat roller. Up in the front of the hull where the keel had been smashed through, I added some epoxy and fiberglass mat, and I really strengthened that repair up front, smoothed it out really nicely, and all the fiberglass repairs are looking really strong and smooth. While the epoxy cures, I started working on this junky old trailer. I took off the rotten wheels and tires, and I bought brand new wheels and tires and put them on, so we're gonna be rolling nice and smooth now. I cut off all these old lights and wires and garbage. I used the grinder and I cut off the U-bolts that held on the trailer bunks. I cut off the jack stand, and I also had to cut off the bolts that held the lights on, and I got all this old garbage off the trailer. I stopped by the hardware store and I got some of this galvanized paint. I call this trailer rebuild in a can because you spray this thing all over the trailer and it makes it look like brand new. It's absolutely incredible. I drilled in new holes into the frame, and then I measured out some bunks, laid the bunks on top of my holes, and I ran in some big lag bolts from the bottom. So now I got nice big 4x4 bunks that I smoothed out with a grinder. That way the hull of the jet ski will sit on it real nice.
We've got the ski stripped down to the bare bones, and it was a lot of work. The jet pump tunnel is all glassed over in the back, which I'm really happy about. I think it's gonna give me about 40 pounds of lift in the rear. So the next thing I need to do is put a deck on the top of this here. So I got a 4x8 sheet of plywood. We're gonna lay it on, cut it to fit. I've got a nice foam EVA deck to go on top of it if it all works out. But the next thing we need to do is lay the board on here, cut our template, and see how it looks.
After tracing out the shape of the hull onto the plywood, I used a jigsaw to cut out along my line. This is awesome because I was able to do all the contours really nicely. I put the deck board onto the ski, and it was a pretty good match.
I like how the deck is going. We have a large surface area on the deck. You can see here, I really didn't have to cut much off of this 4x8 sheet. So I have, close to 32 square feet of deck space, which is gonna be awesome for a tiny boat like this. But before I mount this and get this all finalized, I need to put these on and figure out where these are gonna go. These are a couple of deck hatches here. Got these really, really big deck hatches. I think they're like 16 by 24. Look at this. Those are massive. I'm gonna put a couple of these on the deck because I wanna have access down into the hull. We wanna maximize storage on a tiny boat like this, so you can have all types of things go down inside the hull and stay off the deck.
I laid out all the hatches where I wanted them, made sure that they were nice and square. I traced out around the hatches, and I used the jigsaw again to cut out the hatch holes. I laid the deck board back out onto the boat. I stuck my head in from the inside and made sure that the deck was gonna fit good. And I also marked out places where I'm gonna add some stiffeners and cross braces onto the underside of the deck because I don't want any flex in this deck at all. I pre-drilled holes where my stiffener boards are gonna go. I put Gorilla Glue between the plywood and the 2x4s themselves, and then I shot a bunch of deck screws in to hold it in place. I laid a straight edge across the top of the boat where the deck is gonna go, and I measured a piece of wood so I could attach it onto this old bulkhead of the jet ski. This is gonna give me a nice support coming up from the middle of the ski to help hold the deck in place and stop it from flexing. I laid the reinforced deck back onto the boat, made sure all the braces fit into place. I checked the fit, it feels really good, really strong, so I went and shot a whole bunch of more screws into the cross braces.
So I'm really, really happy with this so far. But I do need to glass all this over so it's totally water sealed.
I did some grinding and sanding to make sure that the deck was smooth. I used a grinder on the edge to make sure all my radiuses were nice and clean. I used a router to give a nice round over onto the deck, and then I mixed up some more epoxy and started applying it to the deck. The deck just soaked up the epoxy. I had to put about 5 layers of epoxy to get a nice glossy finish. One of my deck hatches arrived late, so I traced it out and cut out the hole to add the deck hatch, and when I did, I was amazed at what I saw. The top 1/8 inch of the wood had soaked up all of the epoxy, so this board is going to be incredibly hard, waterproof, and strong. I used spray-in foam from a can to act as adhesive to glue in the old pieces of emergency flotation back into the hull. All the pieces of foam that I had taken out of the ski, I fit back into the ski. And then up here in the front of the ski, this used to be the old anchor well for the jet ski. I just went and broke up a whole bunch of extra pieces of foam, stuffed it in, and filled it in with expanding foam to lock it in place. Now, even if the hull was breached, this foam is always going to keep the boat floating and never let it go to the bottom. Now that the deck is all weather sealed, it's time to glue it onto the jet ski hull. I laid it in place. I chalked the edges up with these little blocks. I then used 5200 marine adhesive sealant all along the lip of the jet ski. I put a whole bunch in there, and then I moved the blocks out of the way and glued the deck right onto the hull. I then loaded it up with some weights, and I gave this thing 24 hours to cure up. I put even more marine adhesive sealant into the gap, and then I also skinned over the edge of the plywood with marine adhesive sealant as well, just to make sure that all the gaps were full, and then that we have a nice rubbery protective edge on the edge of the deck. After the adhesive had dried, I drilled in some holes, did some countersinks, and I put in some countersink head bolts all along the perimeter of the deck to make this thing super strong. I cut the back of the boat flat, used a grinder to smooth it out. I then found a piece of wood that's going to fit along the swim deck and give me a spot to drill my transom into. I loaded it up with marine adhesive sealant, and I shot some lag bolts up from the bottom to hold it in place. I measured a piece of transom board that's going to fit perfectly. I then had to grind down the board that it's going to mount onto, and I also had to add some supports onto the back side of the deck for the transom board to connect to. I put marine adhesive all over the exposed edges, and I put Gorilla Glue onto the cut edges of wood. I then put the transom board in place and screwed it down good. I smoothed out all the marine adhesive that spooged out on the edges. I filled in the big gap on the top, all the screw heads, and now the transom board is looking really good, ready to coat with epoxy. I needed to fill this gap up front and also give a nice strong point for my trolling motor bracket to attach. So I cut this piece of wood, I smoothed it off with the grinder, I then glued it and screwed it into place and added adhesive all over it so it's nice and watertight. I then filled in the gap in front of it with a little bit of expanding foam. I put a pipe in the gap in the back of the boat here and filled it in with expanding foam. This pipe's going to allow me to run the fuel line from the inside of the boat out to the motor. I cut the expanding foam down smooth with a razor, and then I added epoxy on it to give it a nice hard edge. I coated the transom board with a few layers of epoxy so it's nice and watertight and strong. I threw another layer of epoxy onto the top deck. Then I taped off all the rub rails, and I painted the entire edge of the deck, the glue joint, and the entire transom board white. While the paint was drying, I measured what I had left of my swim bracket because this is where my motor is going to attach to. I cut these big 2x12 boards, and then I laid them in place and marked out where I wanted my holes to be. I drilled through the wood, and then I laid the wood back onto the swim bracket temporarily and punched through my holes on the swim bracket. Now this motor bracket has to be incredibly strong, so I used big 1/2-inch bolts to bolt it onto the swim platform of the boat. I then used the saw and I cut an angled edge onto the back of the piece of wood. I then added wood glue onto the wood, and I screwed it into place onto the edge of the board that I had mounted onto the swim platform. I then pre-drilled some holes, and I ran in some really big long lag bolts to help make this thing really strong. Then I put a piece of wood on the side and drew out an angle so that I could cut in and make some big old gussets. Now these gussets are like big triangles, and that's what really gives strength to this swim bracket. I cut it out of the piece of wood, I pre-drilled all the holes, and then I used some huge lag bolts to mount the gussets into the side of the engine bracket as well. Now that we have a super strong engine bracket, I had to take it off, smooth out all the edges with the grinder, and coat it with a couple layers of epoxy to strengthen it and make it completely watertight. I removed all the masking tape from the rub rail. I used alcohol and paper towels and wiped down the top of the deck so we'd have good adhesion to stick the deck mat onto. I started to unroll the deck mat. This stuff is such a pain in the neck because you have to stick it on little by little, remove the adhesive backing, all while keeping it perfectly straight. So I managed to use a pipe and helped roll it out little by little and push it down. Once I got it all the way down, I used the pipe and I rolled it on, made sure it was really flat. I rolled the edges so they were stuck onto the edges of the deck really good. I used a razor knife and I cut out all the holes for the deck hatches. This is really stressful because if you slip and cut into your mat, you've just ruined a $100 piece of a material. I also used a razor knife and cut along the edges of the deck and then pounded it all flat and made sure it was all stuck on really good. I laid out all the deck hatches into place. I then applied silicone sealant around the entire perimeter of the hatches so that they're nice and watertight, and then I screwed them down with the screws that they came with. and the deck's starting to look like a real boat deck. Now that the epoxy had cured on my engine bracket, I gave it a coat of paint, and then I bolted it onto the swim deck with 5 big 1/2-inch bolts, and then I cranked it down with the impact gun and a wrench, and this bracket is super strong. Now that we had what resembled to be a boat, it was time to get it out in the water and test it. I finally got the trailer roadworthy. It's not completely done. It doesn't have lights on it, so I'm not technically legal, so please don't tell the police, but the boat's up on the trailer and we're rolling to the boat ramp. Old School is following behind me with the big boat, and he's got a 20 horsepower Mercury motor for us.
And here we go, we're launching it. And I do think I have the plugs in. Why is that not coming off the ski yet? Go ahead and just shove her off. She floats. Nice. Oh, she's looking really good. She is gorgeous. Let me shove it right up here in the grass in the meantime. We had to tow the skiff away from the boat ramp. There were a whole bunch of other people at the boat ramp. This is gonna be the first stability test of the skiff, whatever you wanna call it. I'm gonna jump on, and already I'm kind of noticing it's pretty rolly, and that was my biggest fear. Let's get on it. Oh my goodness. Look at that, it's really rolly. Let me just jump in the middle. Oh, it's really rolly. Oh no, this is not good. She doesn't want to flip, but I'm definitely falling off if the boat pitches that hard or rolls that hard. We need to see what it does with the motor, so let's get the motor on there. Maybe that'll stabilize it out a bit, and let's just pray for the best. Okay. I'm gonna lift her right up, and you just slide the bracket right to me, and I'll set it right here, okay? Hang on. All right. Old School, you sure you don't want to go first?
No, you do it. You built it. It's on you,
this
baby.
is scary. Okay, here we go. I'm pushing off, man.
There he goes.
This was the big moment. I punched the throttle and the thing took off like a rocket. It was crazy fast, and once it got up on plane, the hull would just lock in and it felt really stable going fast. Kneeling down was very uncomfortable, so once I mustered up the courage, I tried to do a stand-up on this and ride it like a surfboard. It was fun standing up, but incredibly dangerous. If I hit anything in the water, I'm going to be launched forward on this, so I need to build a standing bar for it. I weaved it around and did some turns. It's incredibly unstable at low speeds. You got to get this thing up about medium throttle, and then that kind of locks you in and gives you nice turns. So I'm definitely going to have to do some type of hull modification to fix this low speed instability issue. The motor bracket worked awesome, and somehow I nailed the perfect height the first try. You can see the anti-cavitation plates right there at the water line, and this motor is just eating that water up, no problem. So we tried doubles and see if the motor was able to get us up on plane. It plowed a little bit harder, struggled a little bit more, but it did get up on plane, and it felt almost just as fast with 2 people as it does with 1. If you look up the back of the hull, you can see all the way up to where I did the fiberglass repair on the old jet tunnel cavity. It works really good. And the hull rides on plane really nicely. So I drag raced it against Old School's boat to see who's faster. I was a little faster off the line, but he did start to catch up to me once the mini boat started to porpoise up and down in the water. So I stood up and actually used my leg to help counteract the porpoising and keep it going straight. So we did another race with GPS to see how fast the boat goes. And she topped out at 32 miles an hour, which on a tiny boat like this feels like you're flying. Make sure you choke up on that kill lanyard. That way, as soon as you start to fall, you can yank it. Old School got on the ski and he went absolutely crazy. He started carving the thing around like a total legend. I thought for sure he was gonna wipe the thing out and I was gonna have to come rescue him out in the water. He hung in there in the turns, he drifted the thing around and he rode it like an absolute madman.
The first water test of the jet ski micro boat was very interesting to say the least. We have a couple of pros, but we have a couple of very, very serious cons as well to the way the boat is designed. Now, first off, I like how fast it goes. It's a ton of fun to ride. You saw Old School out there. He was absolutely shredding on the thing like it was a surfboard or something. That guy is a madman. But it's really fun to go 32 miles an hour on such a small vessel. The other thing I like is how cool it looks. Like in the water, it just looks like it's a little drag racing boat. It's got a really neat look to it. I love how it turned out. So I think we have a lot of potential here, but we have a couple of very serious safety problems. First off is how unstable the vessel is. So there's a lot of roll side to side to it. The other issue we have is front to back. We don't have enough flotation in the back, and so the front of the boat rides up out of the water when you're not on plane. So I need to fix this by adding more volume in the back of the boat. Now I was brainstorming here, what has volume to it? Styrofoam. Cool. What else has styrofoam in it? Coolers. Okay, cool. Where else do we use coolers? On boats. So why not permanently make a cooler part of the boat in order to add flotation to the hull? So I went to Walmart and I got these jumbo size coolers. They're like 3 feet long, but I bought 2 of these and I'm going to bolt them onto the side of the boat. They're gonna look like saddlebags on a motorcycle. Give you a little extra storage on the side. They're gonna add flotation in the back, which is gonna lift the rear of the boat up like that, and they're gonna prevent side to side roll. Now, I know you're wondering, can you go fast with coolers on the side? Probably. I also bought some PVC board that I'm gonna turn into strips and basically add skid plates, almost like water skis, onto the bottom of the coolers. The coolers need to be bolted right about here, somewhere around this height on the ski. That gives us some flotation on the bottom, but it still allows the coolers to plane off when the boat is moving. What I need to do is cut some spacers out of wood, put the spacer here, and then that way I can bolt the side of the cooler directly to the side of the boat. I used 2x4s as spacers and I glued them onto the boat with marine adhesive. I then cut some strips of plastic and also put that on the spacers. That way where the cooler contacts the wood, it'll have a little bit of a softer plastic to plastic contact. I then used some more plastic, marked the pattern off on the cooler, and drilled through the cooler with the drill. Now I cut another thicker piece of plastic to go inside the cooler as a backing plate. That way the bolts won't crush the cooler. I then drilled a couple holes into the boat. I ran the bolts through the backing plate, through the cooler, and stuck it up onto the boat. I then had to reach inside, put the nuts, and crank it down tight with the ratchet. I drilled another hole and added another bolt because this cooler may be potentially supporting a lot of weight. And it turned out really strong. You can see on the interior, I used large fender washers to help spread the load out on the fiberglass. I've got the coolers mounted just low enough to add a little bit of flotation and still high enough that when it gets on plane, they should get out of the water. I laid out some pipe flanges that I'm going to use to mount the standing bar with. I took some measurements and I cut up my pipe. This is Schedule 80 CPVC's pipe. It's extra heavy duty. I deburred all my cut edges with the grinder, and then I assembled the standing bar and banged it all together with a hammer. I then went ahead and set it in place and marked off the holes, and then I drilled through the deck and I applied some silicone adhesive sealant to it, put the standing bar back into place, and bolted it all together with 1/4 bolts with big fender washers on the underside so it's nice and strong. All these fittings have a real snug fit, but I put some set screws into all the joints. And the 2 T fittings at the top of the standing bar are also going to act as rod holders.
I cut my skid plates and I rounded off all the corners with the grinder. I pre-drilled some holes into it, and then I spread a whole bunch of marine adhesive onto the top side of the skid plates, and they're gonna stick up onto the coolers. And then I used a bunch of screws to help secure them onto the coolers while the marine adhesive starts to dry. I used a heat gun and heated up the PVC in order to bend the PVC and shape it the way I want it. Once I reached the right angle on the skid plates, I took some water and I cooled it off, and this helps lock it right in place. Now that the stabilizing coolers and skid plates are finished, it's time to work on the trolling motor mount. So I cut a piece of starboard plastic. This is a 2x4 piece of starboard plastic, and I'm gonna mount it on the front part of the boat. So I rounded off all of the corners, and then I routed it so it has a nice round smooth edge on it. I pre-drilled some holes in it, and I used some lag bolts and some marine adhesive to secure the trolling motor mount up in place. In the back of the boat, I mounted some boat cleats so I could tie off some dock lines when I'm docked up at the boat ramp. And I installed a couple of removable fishing rod holders in the back and the front of the boat. These are really nice because you can mount these bases onto the boat, and then you can take the rod holders on and off when you're transporting, and also you can adjust the angle of the rod holder. And now it's time to test it again and see if our stabilizing pontoons are actually gonna work.
Yeah, keep going. All right, feeling more stable already. I gotta tell you guys, I am absolutely floored at how stable this thing is now. So I'm gonna push off and show you how stable this thing is now. Look, I can jump on it. I can totally stand on one side. I can even lean out on one side, and the boat is barely tipping. Unbelievable.
The boat was way more stable at low speeds, but it definitely struggled a little bit more to get onto plane. There's definitely some more drag with the added coolers, but once it gets on plane, the coolers are barely touching the water, and the thing goes almost as fast as it does without the coolers, but it feels way more stable even at the high speeds. There's no left to right rock whatsoever, and you can see the skid plates are just gliding right over the water. I didn't retest it with the GPS, but it definitely feels like I didn't lose hardly any speed. I was kind of 50-50 on if this thing was going to work or not, but this thing actually works like a marine engineer designed it. It's unbelievable how stable it is at low speeds and how fast it is at high speeds. So I posted a couple clips after the very first water test, and it created quite a stir on social media. A lot of people loved it, a lot of people hated it, a lot of people thought it was cool. Most people thought it was pretty dangerous, but very fun looking. But a company called Tiny Boat Nation noticed it, and they reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to try out our AutoBoat Smart Head for your trolling motor? So I said, absolutely, send it over. So they shipped this over to me. This is the AutoBoat Smart Head, which turns any old junky trolling motor into a GPS controlled smart trolling motor. It's even got this cool little remote here and a lanyard. You can put this remote, wear it around your neck, and you can steer the trolling motor. So this is pretty awesome. This is like a $700, I think it's $699 upgrade. So thank you so much, AutoBoat, for sending it over. But I think you just doubled the value of my vessel here. So I rigged up the AutoBoat, packed up all my fishing rods, and set out in the early morning for the Florida Everglades. Got a little gator right there in the water. See if we can get a closer look. Let's turn the AutoBoat. We'll head over there. That's a little gator. We've been seeing some big boys out here. Oh, he's gone.
Found a nice little open spot here, and I'm sneaking it up to it with the AutoBoat. And then I'm gonna go ahead and I'm just gonna hit anchor lock, and I'm gonna lock us right here. And now the AutoBoat's gonna use its GPS and keep me right here in prime fishing territory. So I'm gonna take some casts. I can use the remote control that it comes with to steer it. So we got up throttle, down throttle.
We got right, left, and then once you get to a nice fishing spot that you like, you can press this button that looks like the anchor, and it's just gonna lock you right in place. And then the thing's gonna use its GPS and do a whole bunch of little micro corrections and keep you right on the spot that you anchored onto. It's really awesome. So you can use this little remote to control it, or you can control it from the phone app as well. And what's really cool is the phone app allows you to draw routes on an actual map, and then this thing will just basically autopilot itself all the way along your route. AutoBoat did not sponsor this video, but they did give me a 5% off coupon code for my audience. So if you're interested in getting an AutoBoat GPS controlled smart head for your old trolling motor, check the link below and use coupon code JOE. The fishing was pretty slow out here today, so I decided to have some real fun and tear around some more on my little micro skiff. This thing is awesome having a high vantage point because you can see gators, fish, all kinds of stuff down in the water. And now with the cooler pontoons, it's very stable and agile. Drop a comment below and tell me what I should do with my JetSki mini fishing skiff. Should I take it down to the Florida Keys to go fishing in the saltwater? Should I sell it? Should I build more like it? Thanks again for watching the video, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.